Stephen Stanko, The Calm Before the Silence. April 23, 2005. At 6:45 p.m. in a facility deep within South Carolina's Department of Corrections, a quiet tension filled the air. Stephen Stanko, once described as charismatic and highly intelligent, was entering the final hours of his life under the weight of a sentence that had taken nearly a decade to reach its end. There was no formal request for a last meal. No handwritten statement, no message to the public. The man who had once authored essays on prison reform and appeared articulate in courtrooms had now chosen silence. He didn't say goodbye, he didn't look up. And to those around him, it was as if the walls themselves were bracing for something unresolved. The guards who accompanied him that evening remarked on his composure, not calm but controlled. He kept his hands folded, his expression neutral. A few officers said he looked like a man deep in thought. Others like a man who had already disappeared. For a long time, many had struggled to reconcile two vastly different images of Stephen Stanko. On one hand, he had served time before, written about rehabilitation, and re-entered society with what seemed to be purpose. He spoke well. He dressed sharply. He impressed neighbors and coworkers with his manners and intellect. But underneath that polished surface, something was fractured. What brought him here was not just a single moment or one decision. It was a string of events that began long before he stepped into the public spotlight. What no one realized at the time was that Stephen Stanko wasn't seeking redemption. He was preparing for something else entirely. And when that moment finally came, when the system rendered its final decision, Stephen didn't fight it. But he didn't explain it either. That silence would come to define the case just as much as the crime itself. Tonight, the lights in the corridor outside his cell were dimmed, the paperwork was finalized, the time was set. But a man of contradictions. To truly understand Stephen Stanko's path to death row, you have to go back, not just to the crime, but to the years that shaped him. His story didn't begin in a prison cell. It began in a quiet suburb, in what many would consider a normal American household. Born in 1968, Stanko grew up in South Carolina. Those who knew him in his early life described him as bright, even gifted. He had a natural ability to read people, to speak well, and to make others feel like they were the most important person in the room. As a teenager, he showed interest in books, science, and public speaking. Teachers often praised him for his intellect. He wasn't the kind of kid people worried about. If anything, he stood out in all the right ways. But as he grew older, something shifted. In his 20s, Stephen was convicted of a white-collar offense, an economic crime that landed him in prison for over a decade. While incarcerated, he didn't rebel. Instead, he studied. He read voraciously. He became a voice of reform, writing essays about rehabilitation and publishing a book about life behind bars. When he was released, many believed he had changed, and that's what made him so convincing. When he re-entered society in the early 2000s, Stanko seemed like a success story. He dressed professionally, spoke with authority, and began networking with local officials and business owners. In coastal South Carolina, where small towns run on reputation, he was quickly seen as charming and intelligent. Few suspected anything beneath the surface. Among the people Stephen formed connections with was Laura Ling, a 43-year-old librarian with a kind heart and quiet demeanor. They met through mutual acquaintances and quickly bonded over books and conversation. Laura had recently gone through a divorce and was looking to rebuild her life. Stephen seemed like someone who understood second chances. Laura wasn't alone. Stephen also developed a friendship with Henry Turner, an elderly man who offered him a place to stay while he got back on his feet. Henry, like many others, believed in redemption. He had seen men go to prison and come out changed. He believed Stephen was one of them. At work, at social events, even in casual coffee shop conversations, Stephen knew how to leave an impression. He was the kind of man who listened more than he spoke. He complimented without flattery. He spoke with conviction, and he seemed by all appearances to be doing everything right. But for those who spent more time with him, a different picture began to emerge. He could be possessive. He didn't like being questioned. And he often made others feel guilty for not trusting him, even when they had no reason to. Still, no one raised an alarm. By the time people noticed the inconsistencies, it was too late. The connections he built, Laura, Henry, others in the community, weren't just passing relationships. They were deeply personal ties, carefully cultivated. And those ties would later become the very foundation of a tragedy no one could have predicted. In the months before everything unraveled, Stephen seemed restless. He bounced between jobs, spoke less about his plans, and distanced himself from some of the people who once supported him. But again, no one pressed too hard. Why would they? On the outside, he still looked like the... It was a quiet Sunday evening in early April 2005 when things began to shift. Laura Ling's neighbors remember that weekend as unusually calm. There were no loud arguments, no signs of distress. She had gone about her errands, exchanged smiles with familiar faces at the library, and even talked to her sister over the phone the night before. Nothing felt off. Nothing, that is, until Monday morning when she didn't show up for work. At first, her coworkers assumed she was sick. But when no call came in and her phone went unanswered, concern began to rise. Laura was dependable, responsible. She never just disappeared. By noon, someone drove by her home. The car was still in the driveway. The house was locked. No movement, no sound. Around the same time, something equally strange was unfolding at the home of Henry Turner. A neighbor, an elderly woman who often exchanged morning greetings with him from across the yard, noticed that the front door was slightly ajar. She found that odd. Henry was meticulous. He always locked up. When she called out his name, there was no answer. Later that day, after repeated calls and a growing sense of worry, local authorities were asked to perform welfare checks on both homes. What they found would become the spark of an investigation that no one in Georgetown County could have anticipated. At Laura's house, the front door was still locked, but there was no sign of Laura inside. The place was undisturbed, no broken glass, no overturned furniture. Her purse and keys were missing, but her phone was still charging by the bed. The only thing that stood out was the silence. At Henry's home, the situation was eerier. The door was partially open, and inside things didn't feel right. A few lights had been left on. The television hummed faintly in the background, but Henry was nowhere to be seen. As law enforcement quietly opened missing persons reports, a name came up in both locations: Stephen Stanko. He had recently been living with Henry and had been frequently seen around Laura. His name wasn't alarming at first. He had no current warrants, and in fact, many in the community still thought of him as a reformed man. But the overlapping connections couldn't be ignored. That evening, police attempted to reach Stanko. No answer, no known current address. His phone went directly to voicemail. By the next morning, a full bulletin had been issued statewide. Laura Ling and Henry Turner were both unaccounted for. Stephen Stanko was now classified as a person of interest. But what made this incident so chilling wasn't just the disappearances. It was the sudden vanishing of someone who had, for years, worked to present himself as trustworthy. No one had suspected he could be involved in anything like this. No one saw it coming. And yet, by the time investigators pieced together the timeline, Stephen was already gone. Over the next 48 hours, South Carolina would go from calm to frantic. Tips poured in. Reports came from gas stations, diners, motel clerks. One thing was clear: Stephen was on the move. And whatever had happened that night, it wasn't random. As the hours turned into days, the search for Laura Ling, Henry Turner, and Stephen Stanko shifted into high gear. Authorities had no idea where Stephen had gone, but they were determined to find out what had happened before his disappearance. The first major breakthrough came from Henry Turner's home. Investigators executed a search warrant, carefully documenting every room. There, among papers, receipts, and personal items, they discovered something odd, a journal with recent handwritten notes. The final pages referenced Stephen, routine things at first, about errands and meals, but the tone subtly changed. A line in shaky handwriting read, "I feel like something's not right." They also found Stephen's name listed on various utility records tied to Henry's address, confirmation that he had been staying there. But there was still no sign of Henry himself, nor was there any direct evidence of where he'd gone. At Laura Ling's home, the scene was even more ambiguous. Her belongings were undisturbed, the door had been locked from the outside, and there were no signs of a break-in. However, detectives found a dinner plate in the sink, a half-full glass of wine, and her reading glasses sitting neatly on the couch. It appeared she had been relaxing at home when something abruptly interrupted her evening. The most telling clue came from her computer. Laura had been writing an email draft, never sent, addressed to a friend. It read simply, "Stephen been acting strange. I don't know what to do." This draft, timestamped the night she vanished, would become one of the most pivotal details in the case. Meanwhile, law enforcement worked tirelessly to piece together Stephen's movements after both individuals went missing. Surveillance footage from a gas station 2 counties over showed him purchasing fuel alone. Later footage at an ATM showed him withdrawing money using Henry Turner's card. Still alone, calm, unhurried, the pattern became clear. Stephen had taken steps to stay under the radar. He used different motels, paid in cash. Changed his appearance slightly. But he wasn't running wildly, he was moving deliberately. As his image appeared on the evening news and state alerts, tips poured in. One came from a motel manager in Augusta, Georgia, who recognized Stephen's face. He had checked in under a different name, but something about him had felt off. He was polite, she said, almost too polite. Using that tip, law enforcement narrowed their focus. 2 days later, Stephen was located and quietly taken into custody without incident. According to officers on the scene, he didn't resist. He didn't speak. He simply nodded and complied. Back in South Carolina, investigators continued their search for answers. Their focus turned to the backyard of Henry Turner's property. What they found, hidden beneath what appeared to be newly disturbed ground, would shift the case entirely. Though official statements remained cautious, it was clear something significant had been uncovered. Stephen was now no longer just a person of interest. He was the central figure in a complex, emotionally charged investigation involving 2 respected members of the community, both of whom had opened their lives and homes to him. For detectives, the case was no longer about finding someone. Redemption or deception. When Stephen Stanko was brought back to South Carolina in handcuffs, the media swarmed. It was the first time in weeks that the public had seen his face, and it wasn't the face they remembered. Gone was the polished speaker, the man who once wrote about justice reform. Now he looked tired, expressionless, almost distant, but the questions were just beginning. The prosecution wasted no time in building its case. In a press conference held shortly after Stanko's arrest, officials emphasized the pattern of calculated trust building. They believed he had used to manipulate his way into the lives of those who ultimately disappeared. During the trial, which began in the spring of 2006, prosecutors laid out a narrative that shocked many who once admired Stephen. They argued that his entire post-prison persona, his writings, his charm, his social connections, was part of a long con. They claimed he never intended to rebuild his life, but rather to use his perceived intelligence to get close to vulnerable individuals who could provide him with shelter, resources, and social cover. The prosecution pointed to inconsistencies in his job history, financial struggles, and relationships that became strained before the incident. They suggested that he saw Laura Ling and Henry Turner not just as friends, but as opportunities. And when those relationships no longer served him, he acted. But the defense pushed back hard. They reminded the jury and the public that Stephen had served his time, that he had been a model prisoner, that for years after his release he lived quietly, committed no known crimes, and tried to become a productive member of society. His attorney suggested that if something had gone wrong, it was not premeditated, but the result of personal stress, possible mental health decline, and unresolved trauma. One of the defense's strongest points was Stephen's lack of prior history with violent behavior. No weapons found in his past. No prior charges of aggression. They questioned whether a man could simply flip in the way the prosecution described. Still, the jury was faced with the facts. Two people had vanished after close contact with Stephen. Evidence had placed him at the scenes. His financial records showed activity tied to Henry Turner's bank account after his disappearance. And most notably, he offered no explanation, not even in his own defense. He chose not to testify. Public reaction to the trial was deeply divided. Some saw Stephen as a master manipulator, someone who wore the mask of redemption while hiding a darker self beneath. Others saw him as a man who tried to do the right thing but fell through the cracks, a product of a broken system that offered release but little support. In the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Family members of Ling and Henry Turner sat quietly during the proceedings. At times, they wept. At other times, they stared straight ahead, emotionless. The weight of the case pressed down on everyone. When the jury returned their verdict, it was unanimous. Stephen Stanko was found guilty on all counts. The sentence, death, but even after the sentence was read aloud, Stephen showed no emotion, no tears, no visible reaction. He simply nodded, just once, as if he had already accepted the outcome long before the trial began. In the days that followed, headlines debated everything, from whether justice had truly been served to whether a man like Stephen ever deserved a second chance in the first place. Some asked, was this the story of a cold case? The silence that followed. Years passed after Stephen Stanko's conviction. Time moved slowly inside the concrete walls of South Carolina's death row, where routine was everything and emotion rarely showed. For some inmates, the final years are marked by appeals, statements, or some final attempt to shape how the world remembers them. Stephen didn't follow that path. From the moment he entered death row, he spoke very little. Those who interacted with him, prison staff, chaplains, even fellow inmates, remarked on his detachment. He remained polite but distant. He answered questions when necessary but rarely initiated conversation. Some said he seemed like a man who had already made peace with what was coming. Others believed he had simply shut down. He declined television interviews. He wrote no memoir. He didn't ask for a final statement to be released to the press. If he had regrets, no one on the outside heard them. If he sought redemption, it was kept quiet, perhaps buried in the pages of books he continued to read. According to prison staff, Stephen kept a small collection of philosophy and history books in his cell. He read often. He journaled occasionally, though the contents of those journals were never made public. He never caused disruption, never lashed out, and followed every rule to the letter, but even in his silence, people watched. There was something haunting about the way he moved, slow, deliberate, almost methodical. It wasn't fear or sadness. It was stillness, like someone who had stopped resisting the weight of his own story. In his final week, there were no visitors listed. No family members came forward publicly. No advocates made a last-minute appeal on his behalf. To many, it felt like Stephen Stanko had quietly disappeared long before the state ever carried out its sentence. As was customary, he was offered a last meal. But in a final decision that surprised no one, he declined to request anything special. Instead, he received the standard meal served that evening, an unremarkable tray, eaten in silence. He didn't speak to the officers that night. He didn't pray out loud. And when asked if he had any final words, he simply shook his head. There were no protests, no headlines, just a short press release confirming that the sentence had been carried out in accordance with state law. His name appeared on the evening news for one final moment, then faded again into silence. But for those who followed the case, especially those who had once trusted him, what we still don't understand. Stephen Stanko's case didn't end with a final headline. It didn't ignite national protests or widespread debate. It ended the way many stories like his do, quietly behind closed doors with more questions than answers. Yet for those who followed his path closely, who watched his transformation from former inmate to polished speaker, then to convicted man on death row, his story remained a haunting contradiction. Was Stephen Stanko a product of a broken system, someone released too soon without the support he needed to truly start over? Or was he always hiding behind a mask, using intellect, charm, and second chances as tools for control? That question still divides people today. Those who knew Ling and Henry Turner remembered them not for how their lives ended, but for how they lived. Laura was quiet, compassionate, deeply committed to her community. Henry, kind-hearted and trusting, believed in giving others the benefit of the doubt. Both of them offered Stephen what so many others wouldn't, a second chance. And yet that trust may have cost them everything. Some argue that the system failed, not just once but twice. First, by releasing a man who hadn't been properly evaluated for risk. Then, by offering few guardrails for reintegration into society. Others insist that responsibility lies with the individual, that Stephen made choices, and those choices carried consequences. But perhaps the most troubling part of the story is how ordinary it all seemed until it was. There were no flashing signs, no violent history, no warning that something might go wrong, just a man with good manners, a clean shirt, and the right words at the right time. And maybe that's what makes this case so hard to forget. It challenges the way we think about justice, about redemption, about the people we choose to trust. Stephen Stanko didn't leave a final message, he didn't explain himself. He didn't ask for forgiveness or try to frame his story in a new light. Instead, he left behind silence. And in that silence, the public was left to fill in the blanks. His case became a quiet mirror, forcing communities, courts, and individuals to reflect